Perfect. So Nicole, just let me know whenever you're ready to go, and I'll announce you, and then I will shut off my camera and let you take it from there.
Okay, excellent. I am ready whenever you are. So please go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. All right, welcome everybody to I guess the second last of our speaker series this year, our talk for the month of March. So in a second, I'll introduce Dr. Nicole Meyer from Queen's University. Before I do that, though, I just want to tell you about our next and last event for the year. So on the 30th of April, same time, 12:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we'll be having William Arbour, who's a PhD candidate from the Department of Economics at University of Toronto, giving a talk called Can Recidivism Be Prevented Behind Bars?, which is a quantitative look at basically programs within prisons and their effectiveness in terms of reducing recidivism. So we're looking forward to that, and that'll be our kind of closeout for the year of the speaker series. And before I turn it over to Nicole, I just want to say too, keep an eye on the YouTube channel in the next month or so, because we'll be launching our podcast with some videos and then some introductions of some of the faculty, where we do kind of one-on-one interviews with some of our faculty members so people can get to know them a little bit better. All right, but without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Dr. Nicole Meyer. So like I said, Nicole is an assistant professor at Queen's University in the department, in criminology, in the Department of Sociology at Queen's University. And she's going to be talking to us about virtual bail courts during pandemic. So Nicole, I'm going to shut my mic and camera off, and it's all yours.
All right, great. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing. So I've been looking at issues around bail and pretrial detention for quite a long period of time. And what ultimately brought me to this work was the knowledge that as the pandemic arrived, that the courts were being shut down. And there didn't really seem to be a plan in place for when they were going to open. And in shutting down, what this was sort of requiring was a really rapid transformation in how things were being done. I mean, the court historically has always been structured in this space where you come to court, you physically present yourself, and you have to do this many, many times before your case is ultimately resolved. And so in moving into a virtual context, I had the sense that the court did not necessarily have the necessary technology or processes in place to do this, or to at least to do it well. But I suppose perhaps what's most remarkable is that all things that seemed impossible it's sort of amazing what could be accomplished when there really wasn't any other choice but to try to adapt really quickly. So part of sort of the background or context to this, or sort of why the interest in bail sort of more broadly, is that since the year 2001 in Ontario specifically, and then 2005 for across Canada, we've had more people in pretrial detention than we've had in sentenced custody in our provincial jails. And Ontario and Alberta seem to be going back and forth, neck and neck, sitting right now at about that 68 to 70% of the provincial jail population are people that are in pretrial detention. And so once the pandemic sort of started and we were hearing sort of all these decarceration efforts and different things that were being put in place trying to get people out of custody, and in some ways these were successful, nonetheless this the durability, or how long we're going to see this decarceration endure, is certainly subject to question. So some of the additional challenges that ultimately come up in custody are really sort of enhancing a number of the dangers or challenges that we find in custodial spaces. That high risk of transmission, that if the virus gets in, and as we have since seen over this past year, multiple outbreaks happening in institutions, and sort of the acknowledgement that some of this is the consequence of congregate living settings, of deplorable living conditions, the lack of PPE, the inability to distance. But what makes, I guess, the remand population so particularly interesting is that they constitute so much of the provincial jail population, except most people are eventually released on bail. And most people are eventually released with the consent of the Crown, not after a contested hearing. And so what you then have is a lot of people coming into custody and spending short periods of time being in a very high risk space and then going back out into the community. And of course, at that point, creating risk for anyone for enhanced transmission. So what I ended up doing was in June and July of last summer, I did 80 days of bail court observations at 11 Ontario bail courts. And over the course of those observations, saw 885 bail appearances be made. Now, what was then sort of interesting, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that data, and then I want to speak actually more broadly to some of the more interesting themes that came up in the qualitative data that was collected by the transcribers who were listening in on the court proceedings. But perhaps what was somewhat shocking was how similar the court was operating now as it had been to when I've spent time in that court, in these courts in person. What I mean by that is that every day most cases are adjourned, that the courts makes very few actual decisions as to whether or not someone's going to be released or detained, and rather there's this culture of adjournment that seems to dominate in this space, where the most likely and most widely accepted outcome each and every day is that you're going to be adjourned to another day to maybe make a decision. When we looked at the reason for these adjournments, in over half of the cases, the reasons for this adjournment was the need to develop a release plan. So in Ontario, most people are required to have a surety in order to be released. That's not necessarily consistently seen across the country. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly what's happening in Alberta. But needing to have this surety that's going to supervise your release, or to just simply develop a plan to make sure that you're going to be compliant with any of the conditions, is that half of cases are being adjourned for that reason. And what this then means is that because the Crown is requiring these things in order for them to be released, though it is defense counsel who are asking for the adjournments, it's very much to try to meet the demands of the Crown, to put together a release plan that the Crown will agree to, and so that we can actually end up in you being released into the community, because pretrial detention is an awful place to be, and certainly nobody wants to be there for any longer than is required. Other than that, there was the number of conditions that were being imposed was remarkably similar to about 7.5 conditions. The amount of money being attached was similar. The forms of release was even similar. And so what was sort of striking to me was that one of the only changes that ultimately ended up being seen was that we've moved and taken and reproduced all of the problems that we have in regular in-person court and simply have transplanted them into a more virtual space, where this virtual space could have provided some opportunities for making adjustments. So some of the bigger themes that came out and sort of watching and observing how the court was operating, on top of how sort of similar everything was to things being in person, was that the uptake of technology was awkward and clunky and difficult. That the infrastructure that's required simply was not available. That many sites were using a single conference call line where there was limited capacity to call in and out. That there were frequent interruptions of people coming in and out of the virtual court, people talking over each other, and I mean, really in some ways, so reminiscent of large meetings using sort of video platforms where it's very difficult to follow what's going on. And the challenge here then is that the accused has a real difficult time understanding what's happening in the court, and also has a very sort of difficult time expressing themselves or communicating to any members in the court. So one of the difficulties then that came up was facilitating private conversations, where normally duty counsel would meet with a client before court starts and have conversations about what to expect and what we're going to do and what the next steps are. And now instead this has to sort of happen in court because they're not being physically brought, but not all the courts have the capacity to do this. So what was then being asked was that for everyone on the phone line, and in many locations this was being done by phone, was for everyone to simply put the phone down and then just wait and periodically check in and see if the conversation had concluded. Or they would establish a predetermined time that you were to call back in, the court would continue to proceed. So there was this real difficulty in trying to protect privacy, and this seems to be a completely inadequate mechanism of simply telling people to exit and trusting that they're not going to be listening in on conversations they're not supposed to be doing. Tied in with this comes this real issue around visibility, and visibility in two different senses, on account of the public and on account of the accused. If we think of the courts as always having been open public institutions, you can walk in at any time into any court and simply listen to what's going on. And once this happened, that has completely disappeared. Indeed, the access numbers to be able to call into courtrooms are not publicly available. So it's not even possible for an interested member of the public to simply get the phone number, call in, and listen to a hearing. The other part then, so what we've done, we sort of have locked out the public. The public offers an important accountability measure, a way of sort of monitoring, making sure that things are operating the way that they're supposed to be operating. The other difficulty is that accused have now effectively disappeared. They've been rendered invisible. At the time of arrest, they enter into custody, and then nobody really sees them again. They're not being physically brought to court. And so what then is sort of lost then is this opportunity to be seen before the court, to be seen as a human being who is making a request around their pretrial liberty. It's a missed opportunity for the accused to be able to speak to the court, because they had then sort of effectively become this disembodied voice, that there's something is lost in sort of this personal decision that's being made. But that also, if accused were to use this space to try to mention some issues they have with custody, particularly in the context of a pandemic, we can imagine there's many issues that need to be raised. And remember that limited capacity to speak with legal counsel. So the court then offers a space where theoretically you should be able to put your concerns on the record and know that they are being heard and acknowledged. Except on the flip side of this, we then have court actors who have the capacity to mute an accused doing so when they may be saying something that might be incriminating or might compromise their defense. And while this is certainly being done in an effort to provide protections to the accused, it's also effectively silencing them. And when you're now coming in by phone, not even by video, being silenced, you are now completely and totally invisible. So we've lost then this important check on power and authority that the public might have as an oversight body. And we're also completely reducing the visibility of the accused. And it's unknown what kind of an impact that may have on the decisions that are being made. The other thing that I found incredibly interesting was the rarity with which COVID was mentioned. I mean, this was in June and July. We weren't that far into this that you would imagine everyone had settled into a space of complacency. Indeed, the courts had been completely shut down to all in-person appearances from March until July. So I expected that they would be mentioning COVID with considerable regularity, talking about why we want to get somebody out of custody, the importance of being out in the community. And yet it happened so incredibly rarely. And now, while it happened a little bit more often when there was perhaps like a hearing that took place rather than an adjournment, I think the thing we have to remember about adjournments is that those are effectively short-term detention orders. If you're not released and you're adjourned, you are going back to custody. Sure, your bail has not been formally denied, but you are still returning to a custodial space. And if there is all of these concerns about transmission and outbreaks in institutions, you would imagine that these conversations would be happening with much greater regularity. The concern then is that someone would argue that what you're seeing here then is people going, well, I'm implicitly doing this. It's COVID all the time. We're always thinking about these additional concerns that come with being in custody during this time. But implicitly considering anything simply isn't efficient in a legal space, whether that's a lack of it being put onto the record so that we know and acknowledge that it's been said. But there's all kinds of different legal principles that, if considered implicitly, have demonstrated that doing so is simply not doing them enough. They need to be done explicitly. The additional difficulties we then see sort of moving to this virtual model are amplified for people from disadvantaged groups, those who are particularly marginalized or vulnerable to both risks of infection, to those who've had to work as being deemed essential workers, to those who have lost their employment, or those who are living in spaces of poverty where congregate living settings are their daily reality. We then have these challenges that moving to this kind of a model, well, it has some capacity to build efficiencies and reduce some of the demand to have people, members of the public, come and physically appear in court, to reduce the transportation needs of accused from the police to the courts or to the institutions. But what this also then does is creates additional barriers for folks who may have challenges with internet connections, who may have difficulty still trying to make particular court times well, trying to coordinate with their working demands or childcare demands within the home, and yet this expectation of being readily available to be able to appear in this kind of a format. It also raises important questions, particularly in the context of video technology, of what it then means to be providing the state with sort of a window into one's private residence. That we've used the concerns about what might then be captured and what is then being seen on both sides in terms of actions that are happening in court that wouldn't necessarily routinely be observed by the public, and how to protect those different kinds of conversations that you should and should not hear as a matter of public record, but then also then offering the state sort of this lens of these eyes into private spaces. We then sort of can imagine sort of the uptakes of these kinds of technologies and how this may serve to operate and providing additional avenues for surveillance, for monitoring compliance, for seeing things that really were not intended for you to be seen in those private spaces. So when thinking about what's now going to happen as this pandemic has stretched out and it sort of seems that we're in some ways the conclusion of this seems to be nowhere in sight, I really imagine what we're going to see is a greater uptake of these technologies. And while this offers some incredible opportunities, it does so with a cautionary tale about the difficulties that we're ultimately baking in that previously existed. And rather than going, okay, we're going to do this in a different way, how can we try to address and rectify some of those original difficulties now that we're doing it in this virtual space, rather than simply reproducing what we've seen while also adding in additional difficulties on top of this. I can imagine that we're going to see phone and video courts take over in terms of, some of your set dates, so your really mundane things. Trials, I could imagine that we're going to continue to try to do those in person as well it is possible to use this format. It's certainly a little bit more awkward. But in bail, it provides a number of very interesting opportunities, whether this is about reducing the need to transport people around, the resources and expense of that particular aspect, as well as that personal experience of being transported, being sort of a wildly uncomfortable experience for people. What this then has the opportunity to do is to facilitate greater or enhanced access to legal counsel or into legal spaces, as long as it's something we're interested in working towards. That we have to be able to improve the technologies that we're using and not sort of be, satisfied with both some of the most basic technologies that it's demonstrating are not sophisticated enough or not being used in a sophisticated enough fashion to be able to navigate and approach these issues in a way that ensures access by the public, that ensures understanding from accused, as well as their appropriate representation in this process. The other issue that is becoming sort of increasingly apparent is this issue in time to trial, that because of the shutting down of the courts, because of now sort of the reduced capacity, yet at the same time seeing backlogs of cases continue to grow, it will be interesting to see how we're going to rectify the issue. That while we might look to the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Jordan that established these presumptive ceilings for case processing times, we can imagine then that COVID will be put up as something as an unusual circumstance that was not sort of, wasn't within our capacity to be able to do anything about. Yet we're going to have to do something rather quite radical or aggressive if we're going to be able to reduce that caseload. And some of this, I think, is going to be asking those questions of are there categories of offenses that we're willing to sort of let go, or are there particular timelines that after this point we're going to have to let go? And doing all of this, it brings up the same kind of questions that we see in terms of our decarceration exercise. How sustainable is this? Is this something that we are really serious about completely shifting and changing how it is we approach criminal justice? If we imagine then that so much of how bail used to operate in person has simply looks exactly the same in this virtual space, and the infrequency with which COVID is mentioned, the way things sort of very quickly and easily seem to shift back to the status quo, the fear or concern is that what we're going to do is that we're not going to take this as the opportunity that it is to do something more radical with how it is that we are approaching these issues. And I think this really then gives us a lot of sort of pause to step back and go, what would an ideal process and system look like? And how can we move that into a virtual space? And also, if we demonstrated the capacity to reduce our custodial population quite dramatically in the early days of the pandemic, and yet very sort of shortly after those first few months, we already started to see the numbers coming back. That initial decarceration exercise gives us a blatant reminder that we are using custody far more than we need to. If we're able to release all of these people in one way or another, and I'm not trying to say these were not all sort of bail-related releases, but if we're able to do that because of public health concerns and we can let people out, then we know we're using it too often. And rather than sort of sliding back to those proportions, we need to take this as that opportunity to say, what can we do differently? How can we do this better? And how can we keep more people out of custody? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Myers. Any questions for Nicole? If you're been with the Zoom with us, you can either type them in the chat box and I will read them out, or just turn on your microphone and voice them. And if you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to type them in the chat, and I will happily read them out to Dr. Myers for you.
I will start us off since I put my hand up. Nicole, thank you so much for your talk. This was super interesting, a lot of information. I think we all learned a lot. I do have a question, just piggybacking on what you said in the end. So Kevin and I were just asked by a journalist to sort of like speculate on why the numbers are going up again. So we just received the numbers just for Alberta. I'm actually not sure what the incarceration numbers are, the population numbers are for Ontario right now. But it seems to be the case that we've sort of like done these decarceration efforts until about August. And since then, we've seen an increase, particularly again in the remand centers, which is quite disappointing to see. I guess I'm just asking you to speculate as to why that is. Like, why didn't we use that moment to really push forward with the decarceration efforts? Why do you think we're going back to what we've had before? I mean, we're not quite there yet, but it seems to be approximating that.
I guess I would say that the numbers, I think, look the same. I think I looked at something similar to what you saw. So Canada-wide, those numbers, and Ontario specifically, and it sounds like Alberta as well. And I think, I don't know, it's so discouraging, but it also seems so incredibly expected that that once sort of this fear and anxiety and sort of this coming to this acceptance that this is just how things are, that it's as those people sort of stopped thinking that this was really an area that needed to be maintained, and rather than taking it as that opportunity to go, okay, great, we've let all of these out, why would we let this sort of go? And I think some of that goes to like going and watching the courts going, you're literally doing everything the way you used to, which was wildly inefficient and resulted in so many people waiting all of this time for a decision, and yet we're still doing all those same things. It was like you didn't take the opportunity to go, let's figure out a brand new way of doing this. It was just, how do we continue what we were doing in this different format? The other thing I've been thinking about, and I had read somewhere that where like, police charging had really gone down, but that they were still holding approximately the same sort of proportion coming in for bail. And my sense is that, again, as this is endured, that police charging has likely gone back up. And at least in Ontario, they hold about half of cases for bail. So whatever the police actions are, I mean, they're starting off this process with increasing that volume of people.
I'll jump in if nobody's there. I have a couple of questions, but let's start with just one in terms of, you talked about how in some ways the accused is increasingly invisible in this process. And again, this is another kind of speculate question. I mean, there's been a long-standing concerns about how people's visible appearance might play a detrimental, or depending on who they are, a more positive role in the type of sentence or the types of conditions they get. I mean, could this also be a story about how that the visible markers of race or poverty or whatever the case might be disappear, and maybe there's some benefit to that?
I mean, I think you point out something incredibly interesting, this possibility of like, what does it now mean when we don't see people? And so we're now hopefully be making decisions about, sort of more strongly rooted in legal variables rather than these sort of extra legal. And I think in some ways it could provide an incredible opportunity to do so. What I would worry is that other things would be used as a proxy, or would still sort of whether this is somebody's name, their postal code, or their address from where they're from, their immigration status, or some of those other pieces I could see being used. But I do think in many ways, perhaps what you really are then doing is making this, that perhaps it's the flip, that rather than it's being seen as sort of a detriment of not seeing somebody and sort of losing someone's humanity in front of you making a decision, it actually could end up resulting in more fair processes.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a question from Marta, who's watching on YouTube, or Dr. Urbanik. She says, thanks, Nicole. Really interesting talk. I recognize you may not have data on this, but I was wondering whether you could speculate whether there are any effects of this online shift to life for inmates on the inside and also for COs?
A great question. Thank you so much. I think it has created sort of some interesting, well, really some difficulties that, well, we've now sort of removed that need to put people in the paddy wagon, transport them to court, and then turn around and shift them all back. It's changed the way things sort of operate within the institutions. And so I think there's additional pressures for those who are working in this space to be able to now move people around with even greater frequency within the institution, needing to facilitate all of this sort of like appearing before the court, and that this can be kind of an awkward, like, depending on the institution where it is they have to go within, and how awkward, and the difficulty of, the court likes to do things really, really quickly and often bounces from one to the other, but you think of the needs to keep people separated, to be cleaning a particular space before they come in to use it. And you can hear the frustration in everybody's voice, in the correctional officers, in the police voice, and the accused, that just everything about this is irritating, and it's not, and the sound could be such a problem where you couldn't hear what was going on, and you could just sort of sense this incredible vulnerability, as well as just additional frustration of how difficult all of these additional measures are, and that not appearing or being able to see people with that regularity also raise those frustrations, needing to, if you're not able to see your lawyer in court, that it's an additional phone call or a meeting that has to be facilitated in the institution. So I think it created a lot of additional pressures.
I can jump in if no one else has a question. Towards the end, you mentioned categories of offenses people are considering letting go. I'm just wondering, so you kind of mentioned it in passing. Are those conversations being had? And if so, like, what are those conversations, and are they considering, like, what kind of offenses are they considering letting go?
I think it's a really good question. I don't know sort of the fulsomeness of how much this is being considered. I had been reading some work that was talking mostly in the context of impaired driving offenses, thinking about how those might be something that could be diverted from the system rather than sort of pursuing a formal criminalized process. I think more so it's the provocative idea that the backlog might get so bad that we really have to think about, how are we going to tell Crowns to exercise this discretion within this, to go what lines do we draw around, what are we going to just have to let go because we don't have the capacity to pursue it. And I think you can understand why there'd be so much nervousness around that, because on one hand it could make so much sense, but it also brings into that bigger question of, then what are we doing? Why was this ever criminalized in the first place, if we arrive at a space where we can all agree that criminal prosecution of some of the more minor offenses isn't worth it, or isn't in the public interest.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens. But yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. It was really great. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
The questions are a little slow coming in on YouTube, so if anyone else in the Zoom has a question, absolutely feel free to jump in.
I do have another one, if I can just jump in. Nicole, so one of the things I'm thinking about, and you touched upon this a little bit, is many of the people we meet in prison, like in our own project, wouldn't have access to technology, right? And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the complications that come with that for the hearings a little bit more, because I could see, while this obviously provides opportunity, as you say, to maybe not just look at the legal factors around sentencing, etc. But that might complicate the situation, because people of lower socioeconomic status may not have access to the technology. Then, especially when I think about the Albertan context, with many people living on reserves, potentially not having the technology available, etc. What happens in those circumstances?
I think it's the kind of things that haven't been properly sort of thought out. In most of the courts in Ontario, they were using phones, it wasn't even video technology, which I think opens up all kinds of other issues around, your internet capabilities, having the hardware to be able to do these things. But it's sort of this interesting thought that, moving to this model was likely a boon for all kinds of well-to-do, people that work within the system, going, sure, you have a home office, you have this capacity, you have the capacity to be able to use these kinds of technologies. and forgetting then that those who are being processed through the system, they're incredibly limited access to this, because, though while you're in detention, they have to facilitate that connection. What then happens once you leave? There's not like a centralized place that you could then go to kind of like appear into this remote court. There's just simply this expectation that you have a computer, or you have a phone, and not thinking about that you may not have a private space to be able to have these types of things. The court likes to think of itself as a kind of somewhat regal and formal, and having sort of these things that are supposed to be happening. And so having kids screaming in the background, or someone not being able to properly sort of engage in this process and follow through, I think it really does generate some really significant difficulties. And I think that exactly as you pointed, that we see very clear divisions here that are going to demonstrate those lines between those who have it and those who don't. And those that don't, this being unable to even have the opportunity to appear in person, and may really start to instill additional disadvantages.
I'll go again if nobody's jumping in on YouTube. I have two extremely different questions. One touches on what you just said, but the first one is, maybe you just describe a little bit about the pragmatics of this type of research, maybe contrasting it with how you've done court research before, because courts are historically one of the most open places or spaces for research. And I imagine this has been quite a change in terms of how the research is done. So that's a kind of a pragmatic question. Theoretical, I mean, there's that very famous, historical article on majesty and justice in the court system. I mean, to what extent is touched on what you just said, is the majesty of justice kind of tainted or made more banal by some of this? That's a thinking out loud kind of question.
No, I appreciate both of these, because I think there's something to it. I mean, the pragmatics of doing the research has been incredibly frustrating. I mean, as you point, I do court research. It's never been a problem. Just walk into court, and it can be an excellent opportunity to bounce around from one place to another, and you simply can't do that. And it's, in other ways, you could imagine that it presents opportunities for research. You don't have to physically attend. You could theoretically sit somewhere and be able to call into a variety of different locations or access recordings. I think the difficulty is that access simply isn't available, and nobody seems to know how to get this stuff. I mean, it's a lot of sort of ask this person, see if they can ask this person, see if they know a lawyer who will tell you this secret number that you can apparently call into. And it wasn't uncommon for some of the research assistants, when calling into places, to be locked out of the virtual courtroom, so that there were sort of limited lines available. And so if you were just calling in to observe, you might be precluding some defense counsel from being able to call in. And so they, once identified, they would sort of lock you out of the room. And so obviously then that's sort of frustrating that research process, but again, sort of acknowledging this difficulty of access, that it's this real ability to simply shutter the court, and there's not really much you can do about it, or where to sort of complain about it. And I think all of this is challenging sort of the majesty of justice. All of the ritual, all of the kind of trappings that gave you this sense that something really important was happening has now really been reduced. But in many ways, that's always what the process has been. It's this sort of this disconnect between what it sort of masquerades to be and what the experience actually is. And that I think you could sort of see almost like a heightening of this then continue in the trial, and where all of these sort of much more mundane style of appearances are going to move to something much more basic of a couple of people sitting in a room answering phone calls and just scheduling things in that capacity.
Thank you.
All right, so I've got another YouTube question here. So it's from L'Oreal. She says, thanks for your talk, Dr. Myers. You mentioned that these virtual hearings fostered an atmosphere of misunderstanding to some degree. Can you talk a bit more about what these misunderstandings actually looked like, as well as other barriers to understanding that accused folks faced during these virtual hearings?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, I mean, there was so much difficulty in trying to sort of call in and even be able to follow what's going on, because people don't identify themselves before they speak. So it's really sort of like coming with, without any visibility, coming into a conversation and trying to figure out who plays what role, what it is they're doing, when it changes from, one defense counsel to another defense counsel, or moving between different people. So coming in as an outsider, trying to be able to keep track of what was going on was incredibly difficult. And you would hear accused often come in and complain about precisely this, going like, I don't understand what's happening. I can't hear, it's too loud. So much background noise, people forgetting to mute their mics. You've got all of this sort of chaos coming in through this joint line. And it was also sort of like a very antiquated conference line system, where like it announces your name like this person has joined the call. This person has, all day you were just listening to like this type of thing going on. And there was even a piece that I was reading where court transcriptionists have been complaining about the quality, like the sound quality issues, either by phone or by using Zoom, and going, this is incredibly problematic. We keep, they keep the official record of the court. If it's not on the record, it wasn't said and it didn't happen. And if they can't hear what's then happening, but you don't know if that they're differentially unable to hear like what somebody else can hear, we have sort of really enormous difficulties coming up in that. And we know from previous research that accused have no idea what's going on at the best of times. They just do not understand the process unless they are sort of a very frequent player, at which point they might develop a bit better understanding. But they really are completely dependent in this process on their legal counsel to tell them what is going on, tell them to keep their mouth shut, tell them, what to expect, all of these kinds of things. And this process has completely frustrated that. And talking to lawyers on the other side of it, they've talked about concerns they have about developing rapport with their clients, particularly developing rapport when they're acting in a duty counsel capacity, so they're paid for by the government. And then, so there's some already sort of like some skepticism or suspicion around what kind of legal representation you're getting. And without this ability to like actually see each other and talk to each other, there's concerns of sort of like trust that flow both ways between accused and counsel. And so all of these misunderstandings are there, and then accused don't have the benefit of counsel right beside them to explain any of these things. They may then also be being muted, so they could be yelling, going, I don't understand, but we've turned them off. Like, we don't even know what they could potentially be saying, and there's nobody standing there with them to act in sort of that intervening capacity. And you think about that, like there's reasons why we say people should have lawyers. And your kind of lawyers are usually supposed to be there with you to guide you through this process. They're the expert on this. And we're fracturing that access to those people, to that. And so the barriers then to accused understanding, I think, then ultimately just end up being sort of built on top of each other, being muted and not being able to have concerns, not having their counsel there to explain what's going on, that if they do get to have a conversation with their lawyer, it's so brief and so rushed. And then the appearance is like, it's over. Often in court, like your counsel might come back into the cells and speak to you, let you know, hey, this is what happened in court, and here we go. Again, that process doesn't happen. You simply go back to custody to go, okay, was I released? Was I detained? I literally don't understand what's happened, and there may not be anyone there to explain.
Okay, thank you. I have another one from YouTube here, this time from Mariska. And she asks, she says, great talk, Nicole. In doing your research, have you noticed any sort of impact COVID had on the actual bail decisions at all? For example, have judges been considering the higher risk of an individual catching COVID while being kept in custody when deciding to grant bail?
It's a very interesting question. So in some of them, I mean, like some of the case law has come out and has been indicating that the courts have been taking like very different approaches to this. One, and forgive me, I don't remember the names of the cases, but one that argues that we have to be able to demonstrate the additional risk of each individual person. So you will have to demonstrate that you're particularly at risk because of an underlying health condition or your age or something like that. And so that was one logic. The other logic is like, no, COVID's just dangerous for everybody, and we should be thinking about that for everybody. So what was then interesting was that just how little this was even brought up, was mentioning the idea that a pandemic was going on. And while there may absolutely have been pleads saying, there's not enough PPE, this is a dangerous place, or that they have underlying health conditions, you also sometimes saw the flip of this, of going, okay, well, now you've been in custody, where are you going to go? If you need to have a surety, you need to live with them, but you're not supposed to be with anyone outside of your household. And so ending up having the rules almost sort of flip around and act as an additional barrier to their release, because there's nowhere else you can go live, or you'd get out and you'd have to go live in a shelter. Well, we're concerned about what that might actually ultimately end up looking like for you. And so, or other concerns that came up there, sureties that were healthcare workers. So they came to court going, yeah, I'll vouch them. And they're like, oh, well, you're kind of high risk because you work in the healthcare sector. So you're likely at a higher, like you're likely to come into contact. So you then sort of watch the logics around risk being flipped, and rather than being used as like a justification for like why we should be letting everybody out, it was being transformed into a logic for why we need to keep you in, or why we need to be suspect of this being your particular release plan. So it was really quite fascinating to see the kind of the way you could argue COVID from every possible angle, and it seemed to just depend on who was talking, how they were going to use the pandemic in their favor of their position on the argument.
Okay, thank you very much. Any last questions anyone wants to ask? We're running kind of close to our 50 minutes kind of, so if anyone maybe wants to ask one last question, that would be great. I've used up all the ones from YouTube so far, but if someone wants to jump in. Oh, Prof. Collins, I see you're talking, but I can't hear you.
Lots of nice plans there, Prof.
Oh, I can't hear you either.
You're still muted.
Maybe text it. I can read it for you.
Type it in YouTube.
Yeah, or type it on the chat, the Zoom chat.
Oh my gosh, what is he doing?
He's rewiring his computer. No, sorry, boss. We aren't hearing you. Maybe go ahead and type it into the chat if you're able to.
Yeah, if that's too much pressure, you can always send me. You can send me an email. We can have a further conversation about it.
We're experiencing technical difficulties.
Some questions could take a long time to write out.
Yeah.
I think he's emailing. Yeah.
Yeah. This is good television right here. We'll fix it in post. I'll edit this whole section out. We'll jump right to
Oh, I think we did. Just gonna follow up on Kevin's question.
Dun, 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 dun.
I should go find the Jeopardy music.
It's just making it stressful.
Are you still going into courts right now? Like the virtual meetings, or?
No, though it does sort of feel like it's time to check back in, just so that I can have a sense as to whether anything has become more smooth. I think that the difficulty always is it's also sort of like a fairly intensive activity, like to get to like a number of courts or to be able to sort of tune in. But I'm quite curious, and I've also sort of been hearing at least some murmurings of efforts to try to improve these processes. So we shall see.
Yeah.
I wish. I mean, it's been very unfortunate for any sort of graduate students that would have perhaps gone off to court or whatever, because even though I may have some access numbers to like a few bail courts, I don't have them for plea courts and sentencing, all these other types of things that are going on. It really sort of seems to be an unfortunately missed opportunity. And I think what's sort of fascinating to think about is parliamentary debates or hearings that happen like related to committees in Parliament. Like that's just a link that gets posted and anybody can go and look. It's like it's not like this is completely groundbreaking. I do get it's a bit more sophisticated with a lot of different players, but by now it starts to feel like you should have been able to improve some of these things, that whatever you were doing out of desperation in the beginning because you had no plan, sort of seems that we should be developing a better sort of plan or process for doing this, particularly when we acknowledge that this is not likely going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah. No,
Are there any other jurisdictions that have done a better job that you know of? Like, I'm wondering, like in the US, have they?
It's a great question. I think it's like, I just don't know of anyone who's really been sort of looking at these things. I think a lot of the attention has really been focusing on getting people out of custody, and I would say like that seems like a very worthwhile place to focus our attention. So I almost think of this as sort of just a missed element that people aren't necessarily thinking about as a sort of that nexus in between the courts and correction, or sort of the courts between policing and then corrections.
So I presume Prof is going to follow up at some other time.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yay.
Oh, no.
Yay! Yay. Yeah, that was very awkward. Okay, now I was just gonna ask a quick question. There's actually a follow-up to Kevin's question. Dr. Myers, thank you so much for your talk. Question on sort of visible markers of race and so on. Now, like as we know, sort of race as a concept, it extends beyond sort of visible markers. Often interpretations about racial identity can be made from your accent and so on. And I'm wondering how these bail hearings have sort of amplified those concerns, especially for sort of non-native speakers. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on whether this presents the same, or it amplifies concerns around sort of the racialization or the racial implications of these processes, if you know what I'm trying to say. Do these virtual bail hearings are the same issues still there around sort of the racial issues around this? Are they still there, or do you think they're somewhat reduced?
I guess I think you pointed some really interesting questions. I think there's a couple of pieces there because I don't actually know that I've got a good answer for the question you're asking. So I'll say a couple of things.
Okay.
Get what's up there. Like, so I mean, some of the challenge, particularly for people that are not first language speakers of English, there's always been difficulties getting interpreters, particularly, I mean, some interpreters are easier to find in larger jurisdictions, but in more remote areas it can be really difficult. And so you can imagine that in this context, the additional sort of challenges or barriers of having to have an interpreter on the line who's providing this kind of exchange. And again, that difficulty that sort of, that those challenges were always present in person, and now in a virtual sort of context, facilitating that is particularly difficult. And I think then you also pointed out sort of that while we might have lost or sort of removed these visibility markers, these other pieces are there, whether it's somebody's accent that you can hear over the phone, it's their need for having an interpreter. The other thing that it got me thinking about was that while we can now imagine like that court actors are now just like literally looking at pieces of paper, is there was some earlier work in the early 2000s by Kellogg and Wortley looking at race in the bail process. And one of the things that they found was the important subjective interpretation of the police officer that they wrote on the show cause document that they gave to the court. And that there were different across racial lines, there were differentials in the kinds of things that were being said about particular people. And so here I'm then just thinking of the additional ways that even with someone being invisible, the way they are still being made visible, and that those sort of discriminatory comments are then being made. And because so much of this is all discretionary decision making, and all of those things remain invisible. Like we never see what the Crown, like we never get to see what the police say to the Crown. That's not public. That's never going to be public information. And so
Right.
that those kind of pieces would continue.
Okay. Thank you.
Did I kind of get to what you were asking about? Like, is there any follow-up that can? Okay.
Yeah, you did. I was just intrigued by that question when Kevin sort of pointed to the visible markers, because I know scholars in the US have written about how, for example, the blind see race, right? Mm-hmm. Through sort of their interpretations, through interactions, they're able to make out who is Black or who is Latino and so on. And there's sort of implications that come along with that. So I was just wondering about how this whole process has, if those same concerns are surfacing in this bail hearing process.
I wish I had sort of a better answer. That really makes me think about how, if going back into court to do this, how to sort of be thinking about those kinds of issues again as like someone who's just not visibly observing, but like just listening in to see what kind of markers may be there, or where you're hearing people reference types of things that that might give you an indication that these things are being considered.
Right.
Oh, thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right. So, I mean, I think that's actually probably the worst technical bug we've had so far in these talks on Zoom. So we're not doing too bad. I mean, I think that's about time, that we're close to an hour here. So I think we can end things. So I will say, thank you so much for everyone for coming out, both on YouTube and in the Zoom, and for making it, a great conversation with Dr. Myers. And yeah, make sure that you mark your calendars. April 30th, we'll be doing our last of the speaker series for this year. I mean, we're already starting to plan a little bit for the speaker series for, the coming school year for 21-22. But we'll have announcements there shortly. And yeah, keep an eye on our YouTube channel for the kind of the premiere of our podcast. I'm working diligently on editing a whole bunch of interviews and learning the skills to make a podcast. So not part of my academic training, but it's been enjoyable. So I'm going to shut the YouTube stream off now. For those in the Zoom, if you want to hang out for a little bit, do feel free to stay on. But YouTube is stopped as of now.